Oh, I just also want to say, just, for me, what I'm hoping we'll have is as much of a conversation as a question and answer uh, session following what I hope will be a brief presentation of the paper that Mino and I co-wrote with two others, Pietro Micheli and JJ Singh, who, for me, it's been a wonderful experience of being in the midst of the academic mix. It's a path I have not taken into academia and doing the kind of rigorous research that underpins work like this. So it's been quite an eye opener for me as someone who came to design research at its early stages, and I'll talk a little bit more about that to find which is the watchword isn't as much rigor, it's more openness and intuitiveness. It's a very humbling experience being in that kind of rigorous environment. Um, so let me share my screen and I'll go from there. Uh, so let me actually just say a few things. Let me share the screen, get that out of the way so I don't have to worry about it. Where is it? Oh dear. Oh, there it is. And you'll all excuse me for not having it full screen because if I do that, then I can't see you, which I want to be able to do. Uh, so I came to this paper, Responsible Design Thinking, um, when I first started teaching at San Francisco State with Mino, a section of the design thinking course there in the business school. Um, and through a series of conversations that Minu had and I had in his office, it was sort of me getting acculturated to the business school environment there. We got a lot to talk a lot about ethics, which has been a lifelong interest for me, ethics in design in general, and very specifically in design thinking when that became a named discipline as something separate from design itself. Um, and so I was delighted to participate in this. We started in 2019. It's been 6 years, I think, in the making. I think the current team with Pietro and JJ, we really only started that in 2020, but it was been quite a journey of submissions and revisions and deepening into the research, which has been quite a profound experience. Um, So actually, just on this screen, I'm going to, it's called Responsible Design Thinking and a Practitioner's Perspective. I'm personally going to be speaking a lot more to the practitioner's perspective. And if there are specific questions and deepening into the methodology of this paper, the specific findings that we had, and the specific ways in which we translated those findings into the recommendations of the paper, I'm going to let Mina speak more to those than I will. But what I'll speak to is the perspective of a designer who has had a life, as Chinwe said, really my entire life in design and design thinking, long before design thinking was a term used in the way it is now. Um, and so I kind of will focus on that experience. Um, but I'll start with, and in doing this, I've got two slide decks that I've merged, my own and one that Mino gave me that in the way for presenting this paper as it is. And Mino correctly starts with asking the question, why even talk about design thinking? And I would even back that up one step further, and why even talk about design? Business got on just fine for hundreds of years without having design considered a core discipline of business. And I think what I'll try to show in some of my own story is in the course of the last 50 or 60 years, business has slowly come to understand that design is more than just making things look pretty. Design is a fundamental thing that we do, regardless of the design discipline we're from. There's an underpinning logic and rationale and methodology, if you like, to what we do when we design things. Just in the same way that there's an underlying method to when we do science, and we call it the scientific method, whether we're in biology or in environmental sciences or in social sciences. There's a fundamental process, an underlying process. And so design thinking emerged out of that understanding as in the context that we're talking about it here, it was a discipline that emerged out of two organizations within Silicon Valley that are most primarily known for it. IDEO, which, if you like, incubated it as a methodology that eventually got published as a book by the CEO of uh, uh, IDEO at the time, Tim Brown, as Change by Design. But that was also, there was also a lot of work at the time being done out of the business world, most notably by Roger Martin, who was a design professor, I mean, a business professor at University of Toronto, and he wrote a book called The Design of Business. And that really solidified the legitimacy of design thinking as a business discipline back in 2009. But I'm going to jump from there to my own story a little bit, and that'll give you a bit of a sense of what happened before design thinking became design thinking. I grew up and was born and grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, way in the very southern tip of Southern Africa, so about as far from here as you can get. Um, where uh, but I grew up in the context of South Africa under apartheid. My first dream was to study architecture and be an architect. But in the midst of architecture, to be honest, it was an ethical choice I made at the time to say I could not practice architecture in a context of such profound inequity and injustice. And so I uh, also had a growing up experience of my father was an industrialist and had some factories, and I spent a lot of time in factories, and so it was a shift from architecture into industrial design, and I left South Africa to study industrial design, which was in England, which was at the forefront of industrial design education at the time, still is. And what was significant about that for me is I discovered very quickly that the way I was being trained as a designer was to design pretty things for industry to sell more of. There was very little about the design education of the 1970s and 80s that was involved with teaching designers what to design and how to arrive at the conception of the things they were designing. Was simply were given a package of parts and saying, now, make this look pretty. Ergonomics was a secondary thought. There was a certain understanding this was ultimately going to be for people and we had to make it for people. But relative to where we are now, we had very few foundations in practice to which to actually manifest that understanding that we're actually designing things for people. I intuited that, but I couldn't quite put words to it until I read this. And this is a statement from a man by the name of L. Bruce Archer, who really was if you like, the father of design methods and designerly thinking. He was a professor at the Royal College of Art who said, and I'll read it because to me it had a life-changing effect. There exists a designerly way of thinking and communicating that is both different from scientific and scholarly ways of thinking and communicating, and as powerful as scientific and scholarly methods of inquiry when applied to its own kinds of problems. And at that time, the kinds of problems that he conceived design as being oriented to were mostly uh, problems that were addressed by the design of physical objects. His sort of PhD thesis that he wrote that led him in this direction was for the design of a hospital bed. And what he was really responding to, and the whole design methods movement of the 60s into the 70s was responding to, was the enormous complexity that they saw manifesting in the world. And I would argue that the reason we're all here and the reason why business has taken design thinking on as a core business practice and discipline is because of the unprecedented complexity of the world that we live in. It's an attempt to start taming complexity and not lose the creative, intuitive edge in innovation. So from there, what I wanted to study that further, I actually was accepted to do into the Royal College of Art, where I was going to do my research on design ethics, and on the application of values and belief systems to the way to decision making as a and how our values and beliefs drive decision making as much as our uh, any kind of rational uh, sort of reductive thinking that we might apply. Um, so rather than go back to the RCA, I came to America to study with an architecture professor in North Carolina State who ran what he called a community development group. And what excited me and interested me in there, his name was Professor Henry Sanoff. Um, and what excited me there was that he was running the way he taught was through practice. And he to provide a framework for practice, he had the community development group, which did projects throughout North Carolina. NC State was a land grant university, and so they had a commitment to provide services to the local uh, uh, to people locally. And in this case, it was to cities who needed help in doing community development work through architecture. And so I joined a studio where we went out and did an urban revitalization and renewal plan, developing methods that Henry had developed, or applying methods that Henry had developed, which today look an awful lot like what we call design thinking. It was the beginning of design being seen as a workshop kind of practice. You spend as much time talking to people and finding ways of structuring the conversations that you had with people to provide meaningful feedback and input into the process, into the design process, allowing people a seat at the table without stopping the design process altogether, without turning it into a bureaucratic process. And so that's what I studied with Henry in North Carolina, which, unbeknownst to me, design and that kind of approach to design was beginning to take off. And a company by the name of Herman Miller in Michigan, a very leading furniture company at the time, very influential in in how we even think about workspaces. I got hired on there in their design research group and did some blue sky work with them, future of work kind of research. That then I went from future of work research into seating ergonomics research. I wrote some of the early briefs for the famous Aeron chair. It was an exciting time. We were working with people all around the world, trying to bring ideas into focus about how people should and could work better. After a few years there, I realized that there was something special about this that in the consulting world, in the design consulting world wasn't actually being applied. I had done quite a bit of work out in Silicon Valley or in the Bay Area through my work with Herman Miller and realized that there's something was happening out here in Silicon Valley and they didn't know how to do what I thought of as strategic design at the time. We didn't have a name for it, or research-driven design was another name we had for it. And so I formed my own, I came out here to form my own design agency called Praxis Product Design in 1989, which I just want to put in a plug there. That was 3 years before IDEO was founded. Um, and it was with the purpose of providing what I call strategic design, design where research, industrial design, and product engineering all were under the same framework, driven by insight-driven design, research um, that we did. And slowly built that into a practice that designed a variety of products across all industries. Um, that, from medical devices, cosmetic devices, toothbrushes, and obviously a lot of computers and computing devices. And I like to say we designed the first iPhone. You couldn't put it in your pocket, but it was actually a device designed for a startup company that was eventually acquired by Cisco, who then promptly killed it. But it was an internet appliance that could, just to show how some of the thinking never goes away, it's still there, The idea was that we were going to use regular telephone lines to create an internet appliance that you could both make phone calls on and browse the internet at the same time. It had a very short window of opportunity in the world because the world changed around it very quickly. Um, I eventually got a little bit tired of designing the same products again and again. And even though you're in the innovation business, probably the problem, the difficulty of being in innovation business is if you have an innovative mindset, things don't change quite as fast as your own mindset does. And so I shut Praxis down, um, and went through a series of ventures where I figured out that if human-centered design was such a boon to innovation, then surely as a human-centered designer, I should be able to reap the benefits myself and not just do it as a consulting service. So I worked through a number of uh, uh, ventures. The first one was Gate 3 Work Club, which was really the prototype of what the business model that we now call co-working. I did that in 2004. Just for a reference, WeWork, who you might have heard of, did that in 10 years later. So it was very, very well ahead of the curve in terms of understanding the need for a third place type workplace. But obviously, there are business difficulties that I had in really raising the capital at the time, and couldn't pull that off. Um, but other ventures, designing a variety of photography products, including a system that was going to be very much like Instagram, which would be for connected photography, using photography as a medium of social exchange. That was in 2008, and unfortunately, we had a major financial meltdown back then, and that killed that project. Got into solar power installation system to make solar much more accessible. And Innovationship was an agency that I joined with a friend who had been at IDEO when IDEO was still developing the design thinking framework. And so I joined him in doing a consulting service and agency. But all of that sort of left me a little cold, and eventually left the industry because I felt that the underlying ethics of it weren't being handled very well. And so I started teaching. That was when I joined Minu at San Francisco State, taught at Hult University as well, and eventually took up a position here with Pacific School of Religion, where I figured if I'm going to, the framework of ethics that I was developing at the time, and I'm still developing, is I call design consciousness. And it's trying to understand design in its full context in a social and, if you like, a spiritual uh, context. And so I joined at the Pacific School of Religion, where I felt that those kinds of that kind of thinking, that kind of idea framework could find deeper roots. And so I've been teaching there for the last 5 years, 4 years. Um, so onto the paper. And here again we have one of Minu's slides, and he asks the question, is design irresponsible? Um, and he quotes from a book that a good friend of mine, Mike Montero, wrote, Ruined by Design, wrote, which really excoriates especially the tech industry. He's coming out of the tech industry for doing malicious design, or doing design that ends up being malicious and really sort of not being quite upfront and honest about that intent. Um, we know that at the time we started this paper, Juul, the vaping, the e-cigarette, was sort of the big case of design thinking being applied in an unethical context. Um, but obviously we know now that the world has sort of caught up with that to a large degree. We're in the midst of a series of suits and cases building up against the especially the social media industry, um, really accusing and actually committing the social media companies to unethical practices in their design of the products that are causing harm in the world. in a number of very, very significant ways. And I think this is just the beginning of a long series. We're going to see design more and more show up as the word that is on the docket in court, that people are going to be engaging with if you like, unethical design practices as a cause for concern. I think AI is only going to deepen that. We're just at the beginning of seeing some really, really sort of legally intricate cases trying to understand how how AI as a technology, as it gets translated into product through design, can be used in a bad way. So the research questions we went into were quite simple and basic. What are the main ethical concerns with practicing design thinking as a user-centered approach? Design thinking is the way I've always viewed it is that design itself as a discipline is an ethical response to a world being done badly, right? For a long time, out of the Industrial Revolution, before there were any design disciplines, uh, there were some very sort of damaging products and being put out in the world and with very little thought about what their impact was. And design as a discipline emerged to bring some sanity, to bring some order to that. Design thinking, I would argue, and the whole, especially the human-centered aspect of it, came to the fore through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, as I described, to bring some kind of order to the idea that when we make things, we need to think carefully about what they are and what they become and how they place in the world. So design itself, and human-centered design, is itself an ethical system. So it was assumed that when design thinking, human-centered design thinking came along, it would intrinsically be ethical. And I think what we're learning now is no, it's not. We have to really examine the way in which it's applied, to whom it's applied, and by whom it's applied. And then how might these concerns be addressed in the design thinking process was really a driving question. It's the practical question. It's my reason for being, if you like, to understand what to do about it, how to make things better. Um, This is Minu's turf, but I will say that it was grounded theory, but not that I really can qualify exactly what grounded theory even is. But for me, the real pleasure of this was that we interviewed and spoke to a lot of designers at a very high level of their in their careers, speaking to how they see and understand design thinking being applied in their own enterprise. And I have to say, for myself, it felt very much like doing a series of ethnographic studies, because and to do that in depth with that range and breadth of subjects was really delightful. We got a wide range of understanding, and I have to say, as a practitioner, I can sort of reinforce there's nothing that I heard that surprised me because it was all things that I'd been through and understood. But seeing the coherence of it organized across the spectrum of people with very, very different relationships with industry, some in the consulting, some in-house, some on the very technical side, some on the legal side of things. One of the things that came up for me through the series of interviews was just how wide of a range of disciplinary backgrounds exists now within the field that I've always known as design. Back in the old days, if to be in design, you went to design school. Now to be in design, you can go to get a degree in science, law, medicine, you name it, and of course business in a major way. So uh, to me, these questions were more guidelines for how to bring the ethnographic focus to the questions that we had in mind. We certainly did pose some of these questions directly, but really what unfolded was a series of wide-ranging conversations in which the key elements of what we were looking for came out to be organized by us into through the abstraction process that Minu can speak to better, the grounded theory. Um, what came out of it for us was that we sort of were able to synthesize it into what we call the ethical blind spots. Um, and the one that jumps right out is, and what most designers speak to, is they are often find themselves in confrontation with environmental issues. The environment isn't being considered deeply in the conception of projects and the conception of what it is to be made, what is to be manufactured, what the product is, what the service might be, and how it'll affect people, and more in particularly how it'll affect the environment at large. So that is a very strongly felt ethical issue, and so we identify that. Um, the other one was very narrowly defined users. One of the things that for me has been an issue in design thinking is when we say it's human-centered, that's one way of understanding. When we say it's user-centered, that's a very it's a very different way of understanding it as a with the breadth of humanity. When we talk about customer-centered, now we're narrowing down even further. And when we go into particular industries that serve particular customers in a particular context, they're usually talking about the people who are spending the money, which isn't necessarily all the people who are using or being affected, whose lives are being affected by the product. And so having a broader understanding of who the user is uh, certainly surfaced as a concern of the designers we spoke to. Another is what happens, what was identified as quick prototyping and testing, that what's happening with product now, and this goes maybe to the complexity issue that I talked about earlier, is we develop things in a studio and in an industrial environment, um, and then very quickly scale it up to huge proportions. You know, we have new products and services coming on the market now that within years of their invention see user bases of in the billions. And that's totally unprecedented. And it turns out that scale matters when it comes to product rollout and product impact. And the way it both affects the environment in general, but also people within the environment, individuals who are using it. There's a networking effect that happens at scale that is very difficult to anticipate. And the designers are all very concerned about that, and they raise that a lot. Um, and I think actually, I I was conflating the two issues, three and four, rapid increases in scale, really is a similar issue. It's that massive scaling that happens when we're designing complexity, and you can only model the complexity for prototyping and testing up to a point. And so the question is, at what point is the design team done with the design? And I would argue, certainly one of the suggestions from our user base or our subject base is kind of never. Um, so responsible design thinking uh, made some prescription, some recommendations, sort of framework for the systemic inclusion of impacted entities and stakeholders as a core understanding that it can't simply be saying, let's name this kind of user, research, find out what they need, and off we go. But we really have to systemically and systematically include, identify and include all the impacted entities and stakeholders. Um, there's a lot more, especially as things move as fast as they do, and when they scale, there's a lot more work that can and should be done on anticipating and mitigating potential harm. Um, one of the things we're sitting in, for example, right now, you don't have to be a computer scientist or a PhD psychologist to understand that there are going to be harms arising out of the use of AI. Um, there are institutes already in existence for studying those harms, which is itself for me, as someone who's been watching this train get out of the station and accelerate. Um, the the idea that you'd be studying harm before a product category even formally fully came into being is itself a very positive sign of the response that industry is taking or society is taking to the ethics of design. That we are understanding this as an ethical issue, and as a design issue at the same time, and that we need to anticipate and mitigate the harms that we see, or we will take, or there will be lawsuits. And I think that is a very significant piece of the fulcrum that we're moving around right now. I think for me, and I think for a lot of the designers we spoke to, ethical governance emerged as a really top issue to attend to because a lot of the time, the designers themselves wanted to do the right thing, and they just didn't have the resources, they didn't have the budgets, they didn't have the time to get it done. They didn't have the essentially the management mandate to do the job the way they felt it would be done. It was very critical for a lot of the design subjects that we had to include to ensure that there was the place for them to be able to act ethically. So it's not just the designers on the design team or the design thinking teams that need to be uh, um, impacted by the work that we're doing here, but by the entire enterprise, especially at the governance level. Uh, and the overall shift from a move from narrow empathy for users towards a broader responsibility for consequence model. We need to stop thinking of the innovations we're making simply in terms of the innovation itself, but in the broader societal and social impact that it has, and how it changes things beyond what is being designed. Um, so yeah. I'm going to skip over that one now. We can come back to that. And again, I'll also I think this is making significant contributions to the field. Uh, I think just even having a focus on business, the ethics of design in a business context is a profound and important move. And I think this especially now that we've got publication in such a significant journal as the Journal of Marketing, I think it's going to have an important effect. That user and customer-centered processes are not sufficient to ensure that value creation effort is ethical. Again, I'll put up the argument, if you like, or the principle of complexity. Things are very complex out there. AI needs to be understood not just as a technology, but as a social artifact that is going to completely change our relationships with each other, with technology, with services. And so we're trying to bring attention to that. Um, Identifies design thinking's limits and provides practical ways to overcome these limits. For me, that's a very important one. And people often say, well, design thinking, it's a fad. Um, we're going to call it all kinds of things. Already, there's no one thing called design thinking anymore. When back in the early 2000s, for a few years, design thinking was a unitary practice. There were 5 steps and there was the mindsets. It's shifting now, and it's going to shift more and more. But what at the essence is we need to keep thinking about design. And whatever we think about it, we need to formulate practices in line with how we actually design things and how they actually impact the world once they're released from us. And I think identifying the limits is the beginning of expanding it. And I think what we're doing here is a significant expansion into what is understood by design. Um, and at a managerial level, we're offering tools, frameworks, and governance practices as a way forward to keep developing them. And I think, again, that goes to the center at San Francisco State, which I think can and should play a very important role in understanding what can be done, what are the tools, and what are the frameworks that will help move forward into a more responsible understanding of the evolution of technology. So this is where Minu would stop and say questions, but I'm not going to because I'm a designer and I want to say there's one more thing. Um, and that one more thing is the practitioner's perspective. Not that I have a different perspective, but that I think that within the kind of research we're doing, this is a methods-oriented brown bag meeting. And I think, something that I feel very strongly about is, as a design researcher, I learned very early that the only way to research a context for a new product is to go to the context and be in the context and speak to the people who are in that context having that experience. Because without that, it's just data, and data has very little inspirational value to it. It has very innovative value to it. And so one needs to immerse oneself in a context of practice. And so what we modeled on this paper by bringing me in, I think Minu modeled the idea that having somebody who's actually been in the trenches doing this work is important. There's tacit knowledge that that person carries about the work being done. And if you're researching the work, knowing that having that tacit knowledge is a very powerful framing device, if you like. Um, so I actually did a little bit of research and found out that there are quite a bit of discussion within the business research field along this idea, and it seems to me that there were three areas that I identified that seem to be dealing with this that feel to me like parallels with human-centered design. Um, and the one was in a field called engaged scholarship, which to me just sounded, as I read about it, it just sounded like everything I just mentioned about human-centered design research. Pay attention to the context, pay attention to the tacit knowledge of the people in that context to understand better, to extract understanding and insight and data. The other one is the idea of knowledge co-production, that we really are not just researchers and subjects, but there's a co-production of knowledge going on, and design a very close parallel to human-centered design, and especially in the participatory design framework that I came into it through Henry Sanoff's community development group, is co-design. The idea that you're never designing alone. You're always corresponding with others for both not just data about what's needed, but ideas about what's possible. And so, there's a co-design function to bringing practitioners into the research context. Um, and then participatory and action research, really, the way was studying design research back in the 70s, and well, actually it was in the 80s, the model we had was action research out of the social sciences. And so we based a lot of our methods and our practices on action research, and I see those showing up in the academic sphere, and it's very gratifying. I feel that's a very important piece of that. And then again, one more thing, the one more thing is a caveat that I'd want to suggest is not all designers are cut out to do the kind of rigorous research and to be willing to submit to the just the rigor of it and the arduousness of it. So if you do include practitioners, qualify that they are ready for that kind of for the rigor that they have to adhere to. And so now we can get to any questions and really comments and thoughts and a conversation that might emerge from this. And again, if you have questions on the more methodologically based work of the paper, Mina is here to help, and I'm happy to field any questions about anything else I've talked about.
Thank you so much, Neil. A lot of insights. We do have questions on the chat. Yiquan, do you want to ask the question directly?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for giving us the talk. In fact, 2 days ago, I was reading your JM article. It's very inspiring. I really appreciate you documented everything. I know there's a lot of effort to go through all these interviews. And because you have a strong team with Minu and the other co-authors, so you can get to talk to those famous designers. So I really enjoy reading your article. My question is, in your interviews, did you find a dilemma of trading off between design innovativeness or coolness? and practical functionality and safety. I have this question is because we recently bought a Model Y, and we see a lot of Tesla's Cybertruck, and we know that because of the design coolness, they actually trade off safety. So we see a lot of fatal fire accident because the door designed issues. And also, so in those cases, how do designers communicate with the managers? And who has the power to shape the final product and make that final decision? Because earlier you mentioned about the designers, they want to do the right thing, but they don't have the budget, right? They don't have the authority. They are not the one making the final decision. So I'm interested to know that in your conversation with those designers and the managers, how the power balance between these two sides and how they trade off the market demand seeking for coolness and innovativeness versus what you call the ethical blind spot.
Well, Yiquan, thank you for that question. And yes, it does. It speaks really to the culture shift that's happened from within the design world. The people we were talking to, the people you're describing, where there's a tension between the cool factor and things just working, it was really what the world of design was that I walked into in the 1980s and 90s. Um, and that world still exists. There are still plenty of designers who are engaged in fashion, really, fashion and trending, and are really looking for things that are going to sell products, not necessarily products that have got intrinsic value that sell because they've got that intrinsic value. And design is an ethical discipline to make things feel right. The designers we mostly spoke to are working in that, if you like, strategy realm of design that I described, where there's much less confusion about the, if you like, the need to make things cool as opposed to the need to make them work. Um, and I think very few of the designers we spoke to would have held that confusion. So we were working in a post-design thinking world, world where already the people at the table are coming from that mindset. Not to say that designers of the other mindset don't exist. We just weren't. So we didn't include them. We didn't invite them into the subject pool. And then there was a follow-up question to that. Is there something I'm missing?
So the second part of the question is the designers, although they do have that responsible concept about designing things that not only make things work, but make things right
That's right.
ethically. But they don't have, like you mentioned earlier, they don't have the budget. They are not the final decision makers. So in your interviews, how these two forces balance, how does that communication goes?
Well, I think what we heard loud and clear from many of the designers, I can't say statistically what proportion, that was the core issue for them. That they were very often being asked to do things that they didn't quite see see themselves doing, but it was their job, and if, for example, if you go get a job at a social media company whose business model is advertising and you've got to do features that keep people there for longer, uh, because it's going to sell more advertising, it's going to make the advertising more profitable. That's the job. It's baked in, the ethical challenge, the ethical difficulty. The question is, how do designers individually respond to that? Mike Montero, who wrote the book that quoted this, he would argue that designers can't respond to that individually. It's got to be a collective response.
Mm.
Others will say, no, there's a responsibility at the board level to ensure that design is allowed to be practiced ethically. And in design we have the term affordance, and which isn't just about money. That the design teams need to be afforded the opportunity to develop methods and practices that bring them into closer ethical alignment.
Can I add a little bit also there?
Please. Yeah.
So, yeah, Yquan, so we did in our data is full of these tensions, between or paradoxes that designers have to deal with. And designers and the managers of designers. So full of paradoxes. Our data full of paradoxes. So, and so one of the paradoxes is so several paradoxes. One is speed to market versus responsibility, right? So all of these firms who are developing new products, they need products out in the market soon. In fact, I'm not going to name the company, but there's a company that would compensate their designers and product developers three times their annual salary as bonus if they introduce one product into the market, in a year. So in that sort of condition, you're more incentivized to release a product in the market as opposed to going through all the sort of responsibility check boxes that you need to go through. So there's these paradoxes that exist. So it has to be sort of, as Neil mentioned, and just going to put an exclamation mark on it. The governance piece on this responsibility is super important, not only in terms of leadership, but also in terms of incentive structures and other kinds of HR slash governance models. That is, as Neil mentioned, has to be sort of has to be both bottom up and top down. So lots of designers we focused and this was something that's interesting for me as a marketer, um, that designers often don't want to, well, Neil may not like what I'm saying, but that designers don't want to take responsibility of what happens at scale. So they design for things for users and maybe a smaller group of people, but then the product then scales so rapidly, right? And the use cases that are studied at that level of individual or groups of users are limited, but the malicious users only appear at a much larger scale, and those are not visible during the small scale user testing and so on and so forth, right? So what design thinking is known for, quick prototyping and testing, those malicious users are not visible, use cases are not visible at the time. So yeah, so these are sort of tensions that have to be kind of parsed out, and you need governance and leadership and designers being given the power. And this is what Neil's going to like when I say this. They need to have given the power to continuously be involved even during scaling of the product, and then also introduction and in the market too, right? So continuous sort of involvement. But yeah, so there are lots of, I mean, I'm just touching on one tension. There's so many tensions in the paper that we observe from a leadership and governance standpoint, along with designers, and design practice.
So can I just jump in there because I like what Minu says. I'm going to say why I actually like it, because there are designers who don't want to do that, go out and think that to do follow-up work and what in the architecture world is post-occupancy evaluations. The idea that after you finish the design, you're not finished the design. As I said earlier on, what we call a designer are many things. It used to be we had a very singular idea of what a designer was. They dressed a certain way. They wore certain kinds of glasses, and they sort of really celebrated the cool factor. That idea of a designer, we're all designers. We're all of us sitting around here. If any of us have ever been involved in bringing something new to life, we've been designing. There are people but within the enterprise, the board has always been at the design table. The CEO has always been at the design table. When it was somebody like Steve Jobs, everybody calls Steve Jobs a designer. He never had a day's design training in his life, but we clearly get it that he's making design decisions all the time. And so the question is what kind of designer is it? Are they a policy designer? Or are they a strategic designer? Are they designing the corporate strategy? Are there any assigned designers to take care of business post product launch? So the idea of reducing design to a discipline, separate than industrial design is a discipline, architecture is a discipline, graphic design is a discipline, but there's the discipline of design itself. There's understanding how to design things and how to redesign and co-design them and continue to design them once they have a life in the world, I think is where we are right now. And I think this paper starts pointing certainly the business world in that direction.
Malika, I saw you raise your hand earlier.
Yeah, thank you for the very, for starting this very interesting discussion. So my question is, for example, as you correctly pointed out, two of the paradoxes are, that user cases are not necessarily showing the harmful effects, because of, it's the societal effects is only, is visible when things are scaling up. Now, the question, the examples about social media, or even, Neil, I think you showed the picture of Steve Jobs, who basically said, okay, users don't know what they want for this new innovations. So kind of, sort of in a kind of, capitalistic society, where, everything is profit driven. So how kind of do you see that these opposing forces can play out so that ultimately, this, that users can actually participate, right? I'm thinking about the AI, we have some ideas, but, even if you talk to academics, they don't know how this is going to play out. So that's, I think, part of the challenges with innovative products, like radically innovative products that you are sort of talking about, social media or different ways of doing things. So in some way, we don't like, what are your kind of thoughts on it? That's my question.
Well, that's a wonderful question, Malika. To me, the answer is design methods and design discipline is how we do that. Because what design is premised on is that we don't know the future. We don't know, we all we know is that there are paradoxes. Let's enter into the field of paradox and see what we can how we can resolve it through methodical action. So design methods are a series of methods that allow us to move from not knowing what's needed to knowing what's needed, to knowing what's going to satisfy what's needed, to finding out if in fact it does satisfy what's needed, and if it doesn't, going back to the beginning and keeping on doing that forever. So the question is, which part of that is design? It used to be the design was the part where I took out a pencil and drew something. And it clearly is not design. It's a piece of it. It's not everything. All that design methods, design thinking, design practice, whatever we want to call it, does is it brings attention to that ambiguity, that sea of paradox that we have to go swim through to get to a resolution that we eventually become something we put into the world. And once we've put it into the world, we have to maintain it and have to make sure that it's still doing what it was meant to do in the first place. So it's a constantly changing field, and we live in a culture that that wants things to be fixed and certain. And I would argue that again, especially with this within the business culture, business essentially really wants everything to be fixed and certain. And part of it is no, it's not fixed and certain. So what do we do to entertain uncertainty and to entertain change, constant change? And design to me is the disciplinary answer that we have to bring to that.
Okay, thank you. I understand. So in that context, so you're kind of saying, it is really a process, and that's why the post-product launch process and continuously modifying that becomes so important. So designers need more power, I think, at some level, even at the board level, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
I think at the designers should be involved, maybe at the board of governance level, who can kind of see what can go wrong.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Can I
Yeah.
add a couple things also in there? So there's this idea of what can we do during designing, before the launch, and then after. There's obviously there has to be both sides involvement from the designer, but from we have in the paper itself a number of tools you can use to identify anticipate effects, negative effects, whether it's environmental effects or whether it's other kinds of, and this comes from design practice, and it's not a lot of, they're not new. They've existed for a long time, like red teaming or horizon scanning, these kinds of like tools that are in there. So I would encourage everyone who's on the call here to look at the tools. We have a bunch of tools we've kind of presented in the paper, even if it's environmental effects or stakeholder involvement, also all kinds of lots of different tools, and the paper is open access. So please take a look at those tools. And again, they're not exhaustive list. They are a selection of the things that we found in our interviews. But there are things you can do before the launch, and then of course designers and I like what Neil said. Everyone's a designer, so you have to have that level of understanding of design as products roll out into the market and be continuously improved. And so, and especially in our culture now, in our sorry technological environment, where products can be continuously improved, right? So even automobiles, like I think someone mentioned, was it Yikwan who mentioned her Tesla Model Y or Rivian? All these products are being introduced, improved continuously, right? So whether it's self-driving features or other kinds of features. So the designers have to be kind of like involved continuously. That's before and after. There are a number of tools to do that. So I just want to mention the tools involved in the paper also.
Jared, and then
Yeah.
Kristen.
I had a bunch of questions, but thank you so much for this session. But let me ask a question I did not post, which is the issue of overconsumption and the role of design in that. What comes to mind is that old ad from Patagonia, which said, "Don't buy this jacket," which actually generated much more demand for this jacket, basically because it was designed for environmental use and it had a major cool factor to it.
Right.
So, I guess my question is, how do designers also interact with their own corporations who are clearly committed to overconsumption rather than under? And how do you navigate that kind of situation?
Well, I'm going to go back to my thesis proposal for the RCA back in 1980, which was to look at the beliefs and values of design decision making. Amongst designers, there are people who believe that we don't consume enough. Amongst designers, there are people who believe we consume too much. Business in general, as it's structured today, believes we don't consume enough. Design, in that sense, if you're the designer who believes we consume too much, you are in tension with the business that employs you. It's one of the reasons I'm teaching now in a school, in a seminary, where the pressures, and I'm teaching design oriented to social change, where it's not about consumption at all. It's about the conditions that we live in and how do we shape the conditions to reflect our values and beliefs. So I don't know an answer to that other than to make it explicit, to make the distinction that you're asking about clear, because what we design isn't just a rational decision making. We'd like to think of design, and certainly the engineering disciplines that brought forth human centered design as we know it now, come from that sort of very deterministic belief that what we design is just a series of rational decisions and technically based decisions. It's not. Design, what we design and how we design it, is very, very grounded in our beliefs and our values. And I think there's no solution to that any more than there is a solution to that in politics or in culture work in general. But to say we have to make it explicit and make it clear.
If I can add also, I think since I'm in a business school, And if there's no business, if we make products that last forever, for example, right? I mean, what's gonna happen? There's no economy, right? So we make, we can certainly design products which are safe and people don't have to buy again, like the Patagonia jacket that you're just referenced, right? I mean, they actually take the jacket back and they can also repair it for you, right? Um, there's those kinds of practices are great, but in a business school and teaching students about how to design, consume more response, from the demand side versus production side, there has to be both sort of this idea of consciousness that Neil talks about quite often, is I don't think you're going to be taking away consumption. I think we're reducing consumption a bit, to what is more feasible and supportable by the resources that we have in the environment. I think that sort of consciousness, I think there's a lot of folks have that, and that the individual responsibility also is in there, beyond the producer's responsibility too. So one side in our center, we only look at the producer side responsibility. Of course, there's a big stream of literature and work on, responsible consumption, for example, which we haven't really gotten into. But I mean, those are the areas where folks as individuals have a responsibility to what to consume, what apps to use, what algorithm should we be supporting in our use, or what products to consume, what clothing brands to use, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a never-ending problem. It also is a paradox. It is clearly a paradox between how much we consume and what we consume, from whom we consume, and how much we limit our consumption and still make the economy work, right? So without business, there's no economy, and there's always that tension.
Yeah.
Just one comment because I think the big issue here is not accounting for negative externalities. So to say that business is functioning
That's right.
without accounting for negative externalities is really, those are not profits. Those are stolen from the environment, stolen from society. So to say that they're profitable or functioning, I think is something that I would question. Just
So Gerard, I know
comment.
you made that question also on the comments, right?
Yeah.
About, about the environmental, yeah. So we did find in our interviews that they're seen as environment this is a number one, which issue we saw from designers. Number one that they mentioned was the use of environmental resources without compensating it, so in some
Hmm.
way. So, and in that way, we found in the environment as a stakeholder without agency. So,
Hmm.
as a prescription, so that was the blind spot that we observed, and the prescription that we had was for that was to, quote unquote, give the environment a seat at the table beyond just looking at the environmental impacts, which you can model. A lot of them can be modeled these days,
Hmm.
the
Sure.
impacts. So,
Sure.
so there are a lot of methodological things you can do from a design standpoint, from assessment of impacts, but also, providing during decision making for products to move forward or to prototype or test or to introduce, there has to be that seat at the table. I think Apple had an ad sometime back. I think I want to say, well, a couple years back, which they showed Mother Earth sitting
Oh
at the
yeah.
table, right? So, so
That was one of the biggest cons that Apple put out.
that's
So
right. That's right. So there are a lot of like responsibility washing also that happens, right? So
yes.
so I think, but that's sort of one of the things you could have. Obviously, there's compliance people that would come in, but I think this is, well, our paper argues is not about compliance, it's about, individual and team and managerial responsibility and producer responsibilities beyond just compliance issues. So compliance is one thing, and not everybody in the organization is excited about compliance. Especially product designers and developers and product managers are not excited about compliance. So it's about, how do we teach our students and people we put out there, as product managers, product designers, and developers, this idea of responsibility. So that's a big part of this paper is
Yeah.
what do
But
we
let me
teach?
also just add in, because
Thank
I
you.
think what Gerard, what you're pointing to is, again, who's at the table making decisions
Right.
about design. And one of the big decision makers that we forget about is regulation, government. You know, car design changed radically in the 1950s when Ralph Nader said there's a problem, and they started regulating car safety. Um, we're going to see that the design of AI is going to be shaped as much by any single individual genius who designs something as by whatever regulatory regime we put in place that prescribes what we can and can't do with AI. Um, Regulations and market structures and incentive structures are essential part of the design framework that we're coming into in a world of complexity. And I think responsible innovation doesn't end, certainly not in the design team. It doesn't end in the boardroom. I think it ends in it has to go to the level of government that can impact on how we make design decisions.
For people who
Yeah, I had a
consume.
lot more to say, but I'll leave it at that. Give other people an opportunity.
Yeah, if I may. So first, thank you. This is fascinating. And first of all, I love that people talk about the intersection of design and ethics and then do so on such a fascinating intellectual level. That's really rewarding. So thanks to whoever invited me to join today. First, quick pushback against the notion that there's no business without planned obsolescence. I'm overstating a little bit, Minu, but I think it was a little bit going that direction. I mean, I think there are nice examples of companies that have expanded their business model from making products for consumption into also servicing the product. I just recently saw a great video on YouTube about, I think it was Alden, the shoe company, who first makes products almost for life. But then an integral part for their model is that, you know, you can extend the life of that product probably to over 10 years by sending the product in, repairing it, renewing it. And we see, I think there are lots of good examples, but they're not mainstream yet. They're niche little companies. But I think that would be a good direction.
Can I just add a little bit, Carson? And I thank you for bringing that up. You know, there's of course different business. A lot of this is business models, right? You know, what kind of business models. So there's this. We didn't get too much into the paper on this, but we're doing work on the. You know, obviously you've heard about the regenerative models, right, versus the, extractive models and things like that. So I think a lot of this kind of depends on what your business model is, and you just mentioned Alden, which is, I think we can give the shoe back for 5 or 6 times for a resole or something like that, right? So I think those kinds of like regenerative models are going to be important in the future, but we all know that, right? But how many firms are doing it? This is my pushback to you. Like, why are folks not doing? Because that's where the quick profits are not there, right? So the quick profits, the easy money is not there, right? That's hard to do. At least it's perceived to be hard to do. I don't know why it's perceived to be hard to do, but it is perceived as hard to do. The easy money is elsewhere. So Gerard said earlier, the externalities are easier to pack away and call it externalities, right? So it's easier to do that than to bring in the externality, so-called externality, into your business model, right? So, yeah.
That's where the regulator probably comes in. So these things, all the comments tie together. But yeah, so my main point that I wanted to make is maybe starting with Eric Fromm, who kind of describes the fact that, a design and industry has really promoted this idea of the consumerist person, consumerist culture, and, which then trickles over into other dimensions of life, be they social, be they political, be they occupational. And so so I feel like, companies have contributed to this kind of consumer specificity. Now we live in a life, and my background is way back when in political science. That's a little bit where I'm coming from. So now we live in a world where some of us feel like, wow, we really need a civic capacity to be agents, to be engaged, to express what we want, and opposition and resistance possibly. So my question then is how does design would need to contribute to that? How do we no longer design for the passive consumerist user, but for the active, engaged, creative protagonist of life in every dimension? So how do we design for self-realization, for participation? I mean, open design and a lot of the things you've talked about, I think, go in that direction. But I think it's important to kind of conceptualize, who it is we design, that it's not a user. Prosumer, these words, they exist, but do we have to go as far as producing for rebels, so to speak, to put it provocatively? I know this is very abstract, but it's just a thought that crossed my mind.
I want to pass it on to Neil
Well,
because I'm sure Neil has thoughts here, and I have a couple also, but go on, Neil.
well, I've mentioned what I call a framework for ethical design that I've been working on for a long time, and I continue to develop. I'm writing a book about what I call design consciousness. And what you're pointing to is we're just starting as human culture to understand that we're living in a world that pretty much we've created, right? What we call reality is artificial. Artificial in the sense that it's made up of a series of artifacts that human beings have invented. So this conversation, this Zoom window, the building behind Minu there, we're all sitting in design spaces. Once we recognize that, there is a shift in understanding of how do we engage in it. So the notion that I was saying, once we recognize that we're all designers and we're all designing things all the time, then the question is how and for what and why those questions come to the fore. We haven't had a philosophical language for design until now. If you look at all the histories of design, it's all looking at design as the object. Oh, they did it with this style. They did it with this style. Why did they do it with this style? Why did they do it with that style? That's not the right question. And we're starting to ask the right questions. Who is it for? Under what conditions is it for them? What influence do the people who aren't at the table, what are their conditions in relationship with it? These are design questions because they are questions that influence how we make design decisions. And and I think we're slowly expanding our understanding of that so that, for example, Erich Fromm becomes somebody who has something to share to designers, as a design wisdom to share. It's important to pay attention to that. My own way into when I was in college and being told to design consumer products, that cooker hood that I showed you, I was designing kitchen appliances. It was a project that was commissioned by the corporation ITT, which was used to be the model of the multinational corporation back in the 80s, who manufactured fans. They manufactured the fans that went into that, and they came to the project. They sponsored the project. When the president of ITT fan division showed up and critiqued our designs, the work I was doing, and I said, I'm just trying to make it work better. And I had a particular shape to it and an angle to it. He says, don't worry, it doesn't work at all. We just do it to sell fans. That was for me that was my ethical, arrival moment. It was like, this is not right. We can't do it like this. So that's what took me to searching for better methods, better ways of doing it, etc. And we're still on that journey. We haven't figured it out yet because since then we design things, we are disciplines that design interfaces, that design experiences, that design services. Service design didn't exist as a discipline. It's not that we'd never had services until 2000, but service design as a discipline didn't exist in 2000. The fastest growing discipline in the world today, design discipline, is user experience design. It's called that. It's designing apps and software and the experiences we have. And we're starting to recognize we're not designing things, we're designing experiences. But we're not really designing experiences, we're designing the conditions in which an experience occurs. It's changing the way we think about the design act. So all these, we're in a moment, I believe, extreme culture shift around what it means to design something. And this being having this forum in a business school is part of that shift, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, a couple points to add to that. I think Lantana also had a similar question here. But who are we designing for, right? So this is a very, very important thing for me as a marketer, because when we got into this project, one of the tensions we observed was this idea of like, who are the stakeholders, right? So who are the stakeholders who need to be involved in the design process? So, um, obviously when these words like customer centered for marketing, this is a big word, like big focus customer. If you make something that's customer centered, it's got to be right, right? So it's right for the customer, then it's, customers are always right. You've heard that before. So there's that sort of like framing of customer centeredness, and that triggers a certain mental model in the designer's mind. Then you have user centered, right, which Neil has mentioned before. Then you have human centered, which then you have now what Don Norman calls humanity centered, right? So who are we centered towards, when you're designing products? So, and obviously for businesses, there's also this idea of like you can't be everything for everybody, right? So then you're nobody, you're nothing for anybody, right? So if you design but on the design side, you have design for all. So there's this tension between business and design, like access and inclusivity, right? So we observe this very, very keenly in our data. Is who are we designing for? So and then we do have some recommendations in the paper about especially for digital products. It's an interesting area, and Neil already mentioned reference service design. So, obviously there's practices such as inclusive products council. We have like a whole table of like how can you include more people, more inclusivity into the design process, because the more people you include, it also gives you a variety of use cases too, right? So more diverse your testers are, the use cases become more diverse also. So there's that. It can help you surface malicious uses too. So in that way. So I think it's important to kind of like design from a pre-launch perspective. Use some of the recommendations that we've observed in the market. It's not that we're making these recommendations. These are recommendations we observe that designers are already using, and use those while you're designing the product. But I think the opportunity lies after the introduction, especially for digital products, because the quick iteration and testing and changing and continuous development of products is a lot more possible now than what was like 15, 20, 30 years back, right? So you could quickly change, iterate, and pivot products these days. So I think the idea of like changing product design based on market feedback is critical and is possible. So I'm hopeful, because I don't have a dark view about this. A lot of people have a very dark view about, like, oh, okay, these products are going to, algorithms are going to be like, used very maliciously. They are going to be used, but I think over time, the design of algorithms, will change, and the opportunity to change the algorithms is much easier than putting out an Apple iPhone like 20 years back and being able to change it, right? So the digital products afford you that chance to change and tweak it. So there's a distinction there between like goods and services too, a little bit.
Neil, I have a question for you as a
Hmm.
designer. I'm really curious, like in your interviews, did designers prefer to frame communication in terms of responsibility and ethics, or did they prefer to keep it within the domain of, product quality to make the message, more persuasive to managers?
I'm not sure I can say answer that from the research we did. It's been a while, and we never sort of certainly didn't scrub the research for that particular question.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I would say that the design is on a spectrum, and the designers who are design evangelists, who design who want to get management on board with the mission of creating better things, and meaning that to take, one of the findings we had is if we do design ethically, it's going to take more time. And so there's an advocacy to give us the time that it takes to do this right. And others who just want to get on and just do the next project. I personally am more let's get it right from the, more let's get it right school. Again, designers are, it depends what kind of designer and how they came into design, into the design discipline. Most designers going through design schools and going through more visually based design disciplines will just want to get on and do the next thing, because why get bogged down in all these difficult, unresolvable questions when you can just keep on churning it out? But
Yeah.
that's why design, I think it's a mistake for us to view design as something that visually trained designers do. They are one kind of part of a much more complex process. When I was at Herman Miller, there was certainly the designer who was responsible for that kind of creative function. But I knew there were hundreds of us working with that design and making it possible. So that we were all part of the design team, and we were all doing it. And people came from very diverse backgrounds, very diverse inclinations to engage in the process.
Uh, since there are no other questions, is it okay if I go one more time?
Sure, go
It's
ahead.
Yeah.
me.
So I didn't hear the words circular economy and biomimicry, and which seem to be pathways. I'm not a biomimicry. I feel much better about. Circular economy seems to be another channel for increased consumption. So I was just wondering what your comments and thoughts were on that.
My personal comments are that what you're naming is correct. I mean, back in the early part of, I think it was the early 2000s, was when the book Cradle to Cradle was first written, and that sort of, a lot of designers went, wow, yeah, that's what we've got to do. We've got to design cradle to cradle. A little later, there were, I came into my, if you like, design consciousness was very much shaped by, I'm blanking on the name. Small is beautiful.
Schumacher.
Thank you. So that's how. So he makes a different argument, right? And that came in the 80s or the 70s.
Yes.
I think he wrote that book, which was consume less.
Yes.
Use as much as you need to have a good life.
Yeah.
Um, these ideas are out there. I'll just speak a little bit to the work I'm doing in the at the Pacific School of Religion in a seminary. Inspiration for how we should be approaching design, wisdom, if you like, what I call design wisdom, comes from many sources.
Mhm.
You don't have to look very far to find in biblical texts design guidelines and design guidance. But not everybody follows the same text and has the same interpretation. So it depends if you read Schumacher first and then Cradle to Cradle, or the other way around, and which one you hold up.
Yeah.
We're living in a world of change, and we're living in a world where there's a lot of complex ideas about how we should change. And so personally feel my work is to put forward my vision of it. My vision of it is we should actually understand how to evolve towards a culture that consumes less,
Mhm.
that consumes enough, that has that we talk about. There's a lot of discussion now around the concept of abundance.
Mhm.
And abundance isn't just making more and more and more because we can, because the fact is we can. Right now, we can consume ourselves into a pile of trash
Mhm.
um, and have so much, and we won't be any happier. And certainly, if we don't attend to the distribution problems, we're definitely not going to be any happier. So these are all design ideas. But wait a minute, we're talking about politics now, or we're talking about spirituality now, we're talking about something. No, we're talking about design. We're talking about how do we create the world we want to live in. it's when you put it in a business context, which we're here, and I very much respect Minu's the business context. We have to work with business as it is now. You know, it's over in the polyscience thing where they say, no, we're not talking about society as it is now. We're talking about society as we want it to be, and how do we get from here to there. I would argue that the business world needs that kind of thinking too. And I think that what Minu's doing at SF State is the beginning of a more prescriptive model of business. Like this is how business should be. And business, I think, should be reoriented to producing enough, not too much, and making sure that the right people get it.
Okay.
Okay, that wraps up our workshop today. Thank you, Neil, for the wonderful presentation, and Aminu for sharing your insights with us about the paper. And thank you all for joining us for all these, wonderful questions. And it was such an engaging conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank
Thank
you.
you
I
so
will
much.
see you all next time.
And thank you, Chen Wei. It was
Thanks a
wonderfully
lot.
moderated.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Great session. Bye.
Bye. Take care. Mhm.